Well, when I was 15, I took a photography class in high school, and my stepdad was an amateur photographer, and his dad was also an amateur photographer, and there was a room at my grandfather's house full of boxes and drawers of cameras and lenses and weird devices that I didn't know what they did, like a incident light meter. You push a little button and there's a little needle and it must mean something. So it was from there. He always had lots of photo books that we had access to. My older brother took a photography class before I did. So between all those family interests, I sort of picked it up myself. I got my BFA in studio art from the University of New Mexico in 2002. I grew up here. I'm originally from New Mexico. I went to public school all in this neighborhood for all of my levels of education. In fact, it's all within a mile of here. I went to Monte Vista, and I went to Jefferson, and I went to Highland, and then I went to the university near Mom, as we called it. And after that, I moved around and lived in different places and ended up in graduate school in Minnesota, where I got my MFA in 2012. When I was in school, I was really inspired by the light and space artists and minimalism and conceptual art. Those ideas were really appealing to me because I was amazed by the possibility of an experience or a space being the work instead of a picture on the wall. My mom's dad was a painter for 30 years, and my conception of art as a kid was, I guess, fairly traditional. It's a landscape, it's a picture, it's something that you can put in a frame, it's probably pretty, it's picturesque. And in college, I was exposed for the first time to work like Donald Judd and Robert Irwin and James Turrell, and of course, all the great conceptual artists doing things that people who are not exposed to art, when they hear about it for the first time, think, how is that even art? What do you mean? How can you, like Saul LeWitt, how can you give a set of instructions and that's the piece? How can that? Instructions can't be art. It has to be a picture. So those were some of my early influences. I am inspired by being in new environments, and maybe that's a common thing. I don't know, but living in different places is something that really helps me to see normal things in a new way. So when I lived in Minnesota, I was constantly confronted with things that I had never seen because I'm from New Mexico and I'm not used to the land up there or the weather up there. And what I ended up doing my thesis on was weather related in the upper Midwest. So I'm a big walker. I love walking. I walk everywhere. I also bike, and I prefer walking though because it's so slow. And that's something that I also got into with photography, is slowing down the process of interacting with the world. So in Minnesota, I would walk a lot, and I ended up finding weird things on my walks, and they were inspiring to me. So what I ended up looking at precisely were these chunks of snow and ice that gradually accumulate in the wheel wells of cars. And they grow and grow and grow and freeze and freeze and freeze, and they get so big that they actually stop the wheel from being able to turn. So it's back to that idea of control and the environment and entropy, and how we've got these vehicles, we've got these roads, we've got these cities, and then we get in our car and we can't really go anywhere because these ice chunks that happen of their own volition prevent us from doing so. And I think there's just kind of a silent beauty in that. So I took those forms. They would fall off the vehicles eventually, or you kick them off, and it's a whole cultural phenomenon up there. I would take them back to the studio and hang them from the ceiling and wait until they stopped shaking, and then photograph them in pieces and reassemble them. So the photographs themselves are pretty stark, pretty minimal. It's just the object in a white space, but they're printed exactly to scale. They're 1-to-1. And I was interested in that because I wanted to try to make a photograph that's as close to the referent as possible. and yet they become totally abstract. So that's just a funny thing that happened with that work. But yeah, I'm inspired by normal weird things that I see, and especially if they're something that I haven't seen before. I think my work is a lot about control and collecting and ordering the world in some way. I think a lot about how we as humans have a perpetual desire to control our environments, to make things accommodate us, and yet ultimately we are not in control, and everything is constantly falling apart. And I don't mean that in a terrible, catastrophic way. I mean it in a very literal way. Our bodies are slowly getting older, and our natural environment is changing, unfortunately, in large part because of us. But even without that, all of the things around us are constantly changing, and all we can do is watch it happen. And yet I think there's this tension because we want to put things in a certain place and have stuff be predictable. So I think that's what my work is largely about. Something that was really fun for me about that work was being an outsider in a group of people who are very familiar with this thing, like, oh, those? Why would you look at those? But then by presenting them in this kind of iconic way, there was a conversation about them. There was a camaraderie. There was I've seen the biggest one. It's like fishing. You know, everyone's got an opinion. They ran a story in the paper up there about that work, where it was a contest for the public to submit the name that they have for these things, because everyone calls them different things. They have an identity that I wasn't even aware of. I was interested in them as a form of like automatic sculpture, or this metaphoric symbol of our gradual loss of control and all of these things. But people look at them and they say, oh yeah, that's a carnacle, or that's a Carberg, or they had a whole list, a whole submission of all these different hilarious names. So it became a public conversation, and that was really fun. I'm doing a collaborative project with Paul Shambroom coming up this fall. He's a well-known photographer, artist, educator. He lives in Minnesota, has for a long time, and I've admired his work for a long time. He has an amazing series of photographs of people in small city council meetings, and they all kind of look like the Last Supper. They're these panoramic images of people just kind of mid-thought or mid-conversation. They're amazing and fantastic. So Paul invited me to be in a show with him in the fall because we've been working on a project that is the same project, essentially. And it's something that I started in Minnesota and that he had been doing already for years, but I didn't know, where we would photograph every lost glove that we would encounter in the street. And in Minnesota, there are just endless amounts of gloves and mittens and hats and scarves and other personal debris that people lose in the winter. And I thought the gloves were kind of poignant because they're obviously part of a pair. You've lost one. Like if you lose a hat, that's one thing, but if you lose a glove, then there's another glove somewhere that is missing that glove, and I kind of like that idea. So I've got hundreds and hundreds of glove pictures, and so does Paul. And so we're doing this project together where we're showing all of our gloves in a big grid without identifying whose are whose. So it's this collaborative kind of unauthored project. And yeah, so if I can be compared to Paul Shambroom, that would be great. I don't think I have a favorite artist. I have favorites, and I have people that sort of come back up in my mind all the time. The first person that bubbled up into my mind when you asked that is Hiroshi Sugimoto, the famous Japanese photographer and also architect. I've loved his work for many years, in particular his movie screens where he's looking at a single theater with the movie for the duration of the movie. Glowing white screen, just the intensity of those images, how there's essentially nothing there, and yet it's everything at the same time. It's the entire narrative of the film without any specific information, and it's a project like others that he's done, that he's been doing for 30 years. And I find that really inspiring, especially as a student. It always seemed a little nerve-wracking to have to come up with something and submit it in front of a group of people and in front of a professor in 2 weeks or 4 weeks, even 16 weeks, the whole duration of the semester. It doesn't seem long enough to do anything, and of course it is, and things are very possible, and that's what we have to do. But then you look at Sugimoto and you think, oh my God, you've been making these same photographs for 30 years and they're incredible. And it's that kind of patience and devotion and sensitivity that I really admire. But just recently I was talking to a former professor of mine, Chris Larson, an artist, sculptor, amazing human being. And I was asking him if he had any advice for me, because I'm about to start a tenure-track professor job in Oklahoma, and that entails a big life change, and I'm suddenly going to make a living, and it's a big change. So I asked him, do you have any advice? And he gave me some advice that he's given me before, and I don't know if he remembers that he told me before, but I actually like hearing it twice, because it proves, I think, that he means it and that it's important. So he said, don't get comfortable, which I wasn't expecting, and I was sort of thinking maybe, do you have any advice? Well, when you get there, make sure that you, meet everybody and that you're nice to them. I don't know, something like about how to deal with the mechanics of the job, or something like that. But no, his advice is don't get comfortable. So as an artist, there are these opportunities where you can perhaps plug into something like a job and a salary, and you can get used to that comfort, and that can be your demise. And I find that really meaningful, and I can feel that tug. I mean, we all have these devices, and we have probably television screens, and and I've got Hulu Plus now, and it's gonna be the end of me. And if you pair that with a paycheck every 2 weeks, that's enough to not worry about money for once in a long time. Then it's pretty easy to put your feet up and not go to the studio and not agitate and make stuff happen. And that's what we need to do as artists. We need to stay lean and stay hungry.